It's been quite the week for the markets, with tech-heavy NASDAQ dropping 3.8% just this week, and what's now its longest weekly losing streak since the dot-com bust in 2001. While the S&P 500 briefly dipped into bear market territory. That, combined with consumers and investors staring down persistent inflation, threatens to drag America's economy back into the dreaded stagflation territory of the 1970s. Joining me now to make sense of the numbers is CNBC reporter and anchor Hadley Gamble. Hadley, welcome. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is going on with these markets, and where do you think things are going to land going into next week?
Well, Michael, it's great to be joining you here from the World Economic Forum in Davos. And I got to tell you, words like inflation, stagflation, recession, famine, war, these are words that have been thrown around like confetti for months now. And what we saw back on Friday was essentially markets and investors finally reacting to those negative headlines. You got to think about this in terms of the numbers, as you say. Inflation at this point is running at its highest rate, 40% higher than it has been in the past. You have to understand that when you think about these numbers, there's a real concern amongst investors that this is a market and, frankly, a valuation situation that's getting way ahead of what's actually happening in the real economy. There are also fears, of course, about energy prices, something that you and I have discussed many times over the years. Right now, we're seeing a situation in which oil prices consistently over $100 a barrel, really hitting people at home, at the pump, with prices at gas pump essentially up over $4 a barrel, in some places over $5 a barrel, and that's hitting people's bottom line. So there's a lot of fear about what's going to happen next, and you're seeing that reflected, frankly, in the markets. You've seen tech stocks dropping as much as you've seen since the tech crisis several years ago, plus the fact that when you look at what's happened in the crypto space, Bitcoin and Ether off 50% since their peaks last year. And you have Christine Lagarde essentially saying now, the head of the European Central Bank, that cryptocurrencies are overvalued. She says we really need to get a handle on these things, and we need to understand how to regulate them so people don't blow their life savings. That's really a shot across the bow to many of the folks here at the World Economic Forum, because you have to remember, over the last couple of years here, we've seen such a boost in the mood, frankly, towards cryptocurrencies and what those could mean to the broader economy. So people are finally taking a step back here. You've seen that reflected in the numbers on Friday. You saw that as the stock market briefly dipped into that bear market territory. And there are a lot of concerns, frankly, here on the ground about what that could potentially mean for the economy, the global economy going forward. Plus, all of this, of course, against the backdrop of what we're seeing happening in Ukraine and how that could have a knock-on effect when we talk about food prices, when we talk about further inflation, when we talk about the situation with gas and oil prices as well.
So you started our conversation using the S word, the dreaded S word, stagflation. What is that? What are you hearing about it? And what should ordinary investors and consumers be concerned about?
Well, essentially, that means that you have consistently high inflation, which is what we're seeing, in spite of the fact that so many economists for months told us that this was something that was going to be temporary. So you've got consistently high inflation, you've got high unemployment, and essentially you've got a situation in which this is ongoing. Now, recession itself, which is something that we're now talking about as well in Europe and the United States potentially, is essentially defined by economists as when you have economic growth going backwards for 2 quarters. We haven't seen that yet. And yet we're still seeing that word pop up again and again in the headlines and in conversations. So stagflation, recession, as well as the overwhelming factors of higher energy costs that see no signs of backing down. You remember, of course, this is all against the backdrop of whether or not the Europeans will come to any kind of decision on Russian oil, not to mention Russian gas. Then you have the bigger question about whether or not the White House is going to make any headway when it comes to convincing OPEC plus, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, other OPEC producing nations, as well as Russia, to increase their supplies of oil on the market. They haven't had any luck with that so far. We've already heard rumors, of course, that President Biden could potentially meet with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, to sort of iron out some kind of agreement there. But until you see a drop in those energy prices, until you see a lack of this inflationary environment, stagflation is certainly going to be potentially on the horizon. And now we're talking about recession. So we're talking about a major amount of negative headlines. You've seen that reflected in the market. And you mentioned at the top of our segment about what we saw back in the 1970s with the oil crisis, the oil embargo. I just take you back to the history on that one. The only reason that the Saudi king at that time decided decided to loosen up that embargo was not because he agreed with U.S. foreign policy. And we're seeing this, by the way, reflected right now. The Saudis, the UAE, the rest of OPEC Plus, including Russia, don't agree with America's foreign policy right now. The only reason he decided to back off with that oil embargo was essentially because he was dreading communism, the godless communists. So we have a very different situation at this point, Michael.
So, Hallie, you're sitting there in Davos. You tell those folks, don't mess this up. we got to get it right. Thank you so much, Hallie Gamble. Really appreciate you coming on. Coming up, it's that time of the week again. After the break, Jacqueline Alemany, Sir Michael Singleton, and Joan Walsh join me to sound off on those other Sunday shows. Keep it right here.